All the Federal Reserve notes were redeemable in lawful money, gold. Biden inherited a lot of that inflation from Trump, and Trump is creating plenty of inflation right now. He said inflation is caused by government spending too much money and central banks printing too much money. This is all BS. This is inflation fighting is all about protecting Wall Street. We need rate cuts. Consumers need lower interest rates. We need lower mortgage rates. The Democrats have always been in favor of cutting interest rates. All of a sudden now they're worried that Walsh is going to cut rates. That's what they want. But of course, he denied vehemently whenever the Republicans asked him, no, I'm not going to do what Trump asks. We don't have any quid pro quo. There's no deal. Trump has never even asked me to cut rates. So why appoint somebody who has a history of being a hawk when your problem with Powell is he's too dovish? If something goes up every year, you don't have stability. Prices are not stable if they always go up. Falling prices are better than stable prices. Everybody wants lower prices. If you read the Constitution, you don't even have to understand it. If you read it, the U.S. government is not authorized to print money, right? Issue bills of credit. That's paper money. The states are denied the power to do it, and the federal government is not authorized to do it. All the federal government is authorized to do is coin money. That's not the same as emit bills of credit. The states, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, says no state shall coin money or emit bills of credit. And the only thing Article 1, Section 8 lets the federal government do is coin money. They're not given the authority to emit bills of credit. And again, if you understand the Constitution, you read the 10th Amendment, the powers are denied to the states and given to the federal government. So the states can do anything that they're not prohibited from doing, and the federal government can only do those things that it is specifically authorized to do. And so the federal government is not authorized to coin money, so is not authorized to print money, so it can't do it. It can take money and put it into a coin. Well, what's money? Well, the only thing that can be money is gold and silver, because the Constitution says that no state shall make anything but gold and silver legal tender for payment of debt, and the federal government is not given the authority to make anything legal tender, so it doesn't have it. So it's set up an independent bank to do things that the U.S. government cannot do on its own. So number one, that's why the Federal Reserve is independent.
The deeper issue here is not inflation itself, but how few investors ever question where monetary authority actually begins. As Peter Schiff points out here, the argument is that the legal foundation behind modern central banking was never meant to resemble today's unlimited currency system. Since 2020, the Federal Reserve balance sheet expanded by trillions, yet most coverage frame that as routine policy rather than a structural shift in power. For long-term investors, that matters because confidence in institutions often moves markets before earnings ever do. Next, Peter Schiff unravels how that original monetary design changed once private banking notes became centralized.
But one of the main goals was to create a superior banknote to the private banknotes that were already in circulation at the time. You see, even though we were on a gold standard, banks, private banks all over the country issued note currency backed by gold. But the problem was, what if I had a note from a bank in Boston and I went out to California and I tried to spend it? How does somebody in California know it's real? He might not know what banks are in Boston. Maybe it's counterfeit. There was a lot of questions. It was hard, if you took the note far away from where it was issued, because, we didn't have these big banks that had branches all over the country, and you didn't even have a telephone. You couldn't validate. I mean, we guess they had the telegraph at that time, but it wasn't as easy to validate if a check was any good. Or a note, not even a check, a bank note, right? An IOU from a bank. And, some of them had dubious quality. You didn't know how much gold actually backed it up, right? Who the hell knew? So the idea was to create a Federal Reserve note, a private bank, and the Federal Reserve note would rediscount the notes of other banks. So what would happen is if you had a note from a bank in Boston, instead of taking that note out to California, you would take that note to the Federal Reserve.
What sounds like a convenience upgrade can quietly become a control mechanism once trust is centralized in one institution. As Peter Schiff points out here, the Federal Reserve note was sold as a cleaner solution to the confusion of thousands of private banknotes moving across states. The problem for investors is that standardization often creates dependence, because once one system becomes dominant, oversight becomes harder to challenge. Markets still react the same way today when liquidity is concentrated into a handful of institutions that investors assume cannot fail. Next, Peter Schiff discusses how that new note was originally backed very differently from what exists now.
You would give it to them, and they would substitute their own note. They'd give you a Federal Reserve note. They would take that note and give you a Federal Reserve note. Now, what the Federal Reserve was required to have backing its note was that note plus 40% gold. So the Federal Reserve had to back each one of its notes with the note of another bank plus have 40% gold backing it up. Now, you take that note, that Federal Reserve note, to California, and now the California bank recognize, not the bank, whoever you give it to, oh yeah, that's a Federal Reserve note. That's the Bank of the United States. That's our central bank. I recognize that. I'll take that note. And it was supposed to be of higher quality than other notes that didn't have 40% gold backing. Maybe they had 30% or 20%. But of course, the IOU was 100% redeemable in gold. You could always get gold. So if you had a note for $100, you could get 5 ounces of gold because gold was $20 an ounce. So we were always on the gold standard. All the Federal Reserve notes were redeemable in lawful money, gold. But in order to issue the Federal Reserve note, they had to be 100% back by another form of commercial paper, a note from another bank, and 40% gold. High quality notes. What is the Federal Reserve note backed by now? Nothing. It's got lower quality than any of the notes that were in circulation prior to 1913. So instead of a superior note, it's a lousy note.
The part many investors miss is that trust once required visible collateral, not just policy promises from officials. As Peter Schiff points out here, early Federal Reserve notes were tied to both commercial paper and a 40% gold reserve, which imposed discipline on expansion. Today, fiat currency depends largely on confidence, and that confidence can weaken quickly when debt climbs faster than productivity. With US federal debt now above $34 trillion, currency credibility becomes a portfolio issue, not just a political debate. Next, Peter Schiff shows why that shift changed how inflation risk now reaches ordinary investors.
But anyway, now you have some background on the Fed, because none of this stuff came up today in the Warsh hearings. And, the first thing that they said, look, first you have the chairman, the Republican chairman, the Democratic chairwoman, they make their speech. And of course, the Republicans use the Warsh confirmation to blame all the inflation on Biden, which is very disingenuous. Biden inherited a lot of that inflation from Trump. And Trump is creating plenty of inflation right now. In fact, at one point during the 2.5 hours, probably the best thing that Warsh said is he acknowledged that inflation is not caused by economic growth. He said inflation is caused by government spending too much money and central banks printing too much money. That's right. 100% right. At least he knows that. But once you understand that, how can you claim that Trump is not responsible for any inflation? We had a massive increase in government spending under Trump and a massive increase in money supply under Trump. Trump's responsible for a lot of inflation. And Trump right now is already growing government spending more than Biden did. And so if the Republicans are going to blame inflation on the deficit spending of Biden, how could they ignore the fact that Trump is spending even more and is going to run even bigger deficits than Biden did? It's not like Democratic spending causes inflation, but Republican spending doesn't. It's the same thing.
Political blame often moves faster than honest math when inflation becomes impossible to ignore. As Peter Schiff points out here, both parties routinely attack inflation only when the other side controls the spending. Investors should watch policy totals instead of campaign language because deficit expansion under multiple administrations has pushed the same long-term pressure into bonds and purchasing power. The market rarely prices political hypocrisy immediately, but it eventually prices the debt that hypocrisy creates. Next, Peter Schiff talks about why even rate cut arguments can suddenly change when political incentives start shifting.
And money supply is already growing. So that pisses me off, right, when I hear that. Then, of course, Elizabeth Warren immediately just lays in to Walsh. Now, some of what she says, she has a point, but a lot of it is sheer hypocrisy. Because one of the things that she was upset at Walsh for doing was not cutting rates or not advocating for rate cuts around the time of the 2008 financial crisis by being too hawkish. But now she's worried he's going to be too much of a dove. In fact, all of these Democrats who are worried that Walsh is going to just cut interest rates, that's what they always want. They want rate cuts no matter what. Now they're saying, oh, you're not going to be tough enough on inflation. Well, since when do the Democrats give a shit about being tough on inflation? They have always said this is all BS. This is inflation fighting is all about protecting Wall Street. We need rate cuts. Consumers need lower interest rates. We need lower mortgage rates. The Democrats have always been in favor of cutting interest rates. All of a sudden now they're worried that Walsh is going to cut rates. That's what they want. But now they're only saying this because they know that Trump wants rates to be cut, which of course is true. And, they're trying to accuse him of just being a puppet. She was calling him a sock puppet of Trump.
Rate policy suddenly sounds principled when politics changes who benefits from easier money. As Peter Schiff points out here, the same voices that once demanded aggressive cuts can quickly rebrand themselves as inflation hawks when the optics become uncomfortable. Investors should remember that the Federal Reserve's September and December meetings often move sectors more than quarterly earnings because policy expectations drive valuations. When public narratives shift this fast, it usually reveals positioning beneath the headlines rather than conviction. Next, Peter Schiff unravels whether independence at the Fed is becoming more theater than reality for markets.
But of course, he denied vehemently whenever the Republicans asked him, no, I'm not going to do what Trump asks. We don't have any quid pro quo. There's no deal. Trump has never even asked me to cut rates. And even if he asked me, I'm not going to follow him, right? I'm going to do what I believe is right, regardless of what the president says. Now, of course, would Trump really be nominating a guy who has a history of being a hawk when a lot of other Fed chairs were doves, when Trump's primary criticism of Powell is that he's not being dovish enough? So why appoint somebody who has a history of being a hawk when your problem with Powell is he's too dovish? So it doesn't really pass the smell test that Trump has no idea what this guy is going to do. And he's just taking a chance. And maybe he's going to be a bigger hawk than Powell. And he says Powell's a low IQ, idiot, moron, whatever, doesn't know what he's doing, right? He should be slashing interest rates. Now, of course, when Walsh, when he started to talk, right, he immediately talks about how he loves the Fed. It's this great institution, and, he really, he's really excited, and he's a public servant. And, of course, the guy's super rich, and not only is he rich, his wife is even richer.
Sometimes the loudest claim of independence is the first sign investors should question it. As Peter Schiff points out here, the contradiction is not in what Walsh says publicly, but in why a president who wants lower rates would choose someone branded as a hawk. Markets usually look past these political alignments until policy actually shifts, but bond traders often price those expectations months in advance. With Treasury yields reacting to every Fed signal, credibility matters more than reassuring language. Next, Peter Schiff discusses why Warsh's admiration for the institution may reveal more than his denials ever could.
He married into a lot of money. So he's a very wealthy guy. Again, not that I'm against wealthy guys or wealthy women for that matter. But he could afford public service, right? Because he obviously doesn't need any money. It's the Estee Lauder family, right? That's his wife. It's from that fashion icon dynasty, whatever. But anyway, so but he's talking about how much he loves this great institution, and so that's where he lost me right away, because it's a lousy institution. It's got a horrible track record. I want a guy that hates the institution and wants to try to rein it in, not a guy that thinks it's the greatest thing going. He's like so excited. At least Alan Greenspan, he was very critical of the Fed before he got appointed. And that was a good thing. Hey, a guy that doesn't like the Fed, maybe that's good to have a Fed basher running the Fed, right? But if the guy's talking about how much it's, how great this institution is and how he loves everybody associated with it, he loses my support right there, because, as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the worst things we got. He talks about the dual mandate, which, of course, is bullshit. But he talked about price stability.
Wealth can remove financial pressure, but it does not automatically remove institutional loyalty. As Peter Schiff points out here, the concern is that someone who openly praises the Federal Reserve may be less willing to challenge the system investors increasingly depend on. Since 2008, repeated intervention has pushed many portfolios higher, but it has also trained markets to expect rescue instead of discipline. That kind of dependence can create hidden risk when confidence finally breaks under stress. Next, Peter Schiff shows why the Fed's definition of price stability may be far different from what ordinary households experience.
And he said that he has his own definition of price stability. Because the way the Fed defines it, or most people on the Fed, they define price stability as prices that go up by about 2% a year. And of course, for the last 5 years, they've been going up a lot more than that, right? But their definition of stable prices is prices that go up every year by about 2%, if not more. So Warsh's definition of price stability is prices that go up, but they don't go up by enough to get anybody to talk about it. So it's not a problem. It's like we can live with it. So his definition of price stability is prices that don't rise by so much that it becomes a big problem, right? But what's lost in all this redefining of the word price stability is the root stable, right? Price stability has to do with stable prices. Stable is the word. What does stable mean? Like steady, unchanged, right? Remains the same. That's stable. If something goes up every year, you don't have stability. Prices are not stable if they always go up. You just have rising prices. So if the goal of the Fed was stable prices, it meant that prices stayed the same over time. They reinvented stability to mean prices go up every single year. But that's not the mandate. The mandate is not for rising prices, just rising slowly. The mandate is for prices to be stable. They redefined it. Now, of course, stable prices are not the holy grail of economics. What if prices are supposed to go down? Let them go down.
The market often accepts redefined language long before it questions the consequences behind it. As Peter Schiff points out here, the phrase price stability now means prices rising slowly instead of purchasing power remaining intact. Investors hear 2% inflation as harmless, yet over 10 years that quietly erodes nearly 20% of cash value without a headline panic. That matters because portfolios must outperform not just inflation reports, but the steady loss of real spending power. Next, Peter Schiff unravels why falling prices may not be the economic threat policymakers constantly portray them to be.
Falling prices are better than stable prices. Everybody wants lower prices. I can buy more stuff if prices are lower. Businesses, they strive to lower their prices so they can sell more stuff. That's why they have sales. When you have a sale, they don't raise the price. Hey, hurry up and buy. I just jacked up the price. No, the way you get people to hurry up and buy, hey, I cut the price. Oh, great, let me buy some, right? So everybody benefits from falling prices. So again, I mean, I've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to keep talking about it now, but it's all bullshit. But again, he still buys into the idea that price stability means that prices aren't stable at all. It means that they just keep going up.
Investors are taught to fear falling prices, even while consumers chase them every single day. As Peter Schiff points out here, the narrative around deflation often ignores that productivity naturally makes goods cheaper over time. Technology has already shown this pattern, where better products frequently cost less, yet central banks still frame lower prices as economic danger. That disconnect matters because policy built on resisting natural price declines can push asset bubbles higher while household purchasing power keeps shrinking. Next, Peter Schiff talks about how political hearings avoid confronting the real source behind persistent inflation.